When science tries to answer the question, who am I, or who are we? They say that to answer that question, they must first answer 6 sub-questions. They are called the perennial questions of life. They're called perennial because these are questions that have been asked by every civilization from the time that records have been kept when it comes to this understanding. 6 sub-questions, and scientists say if we can answer those 6 questions, now we can answer the big question, who are we? Hello, I'm Greg Braden, and I'd like to welcome you to the second video in this series. In our last video, we explored a very, very powerful question. It was a simple question, who am I? And there are a lot of us in this world. The question became, who are we? For 5,000 years, those who have come before us, our indigenous ancestors, they answered the question in a way that made sense to them. It wasn't science, but it worked for them. It helped them to create better lives and stronger families and stronger, healthier communities. We live in the modern world, in the Western world, the world of science. Science is only about 300 years old. And for 300 years, science has asked the very same question. Who am I as individuals? Who are we collectively? And science has developed a story based upon what they have believed to be true over these last 300 years. I mentioned in the last video that new discoveries now have overturned 150 years of that thinking, 150 years of the scientific story. A new story is emerging. It's a story of you and me, and a new understanding of who we are in our relationship to the world, and that is what I want to talk to you about right now. So what I'm going to invite you to do, in the whiteboard of your mind, if you can envision an inverted pyramid, an upside down pyramid, so the apex, the point is at the bottom, and it's at the point where we will begin with the most fundamental of these 6 questions, and then I will quickly go through each of the subsequent questions as we move to the top of the pyramid. So the very first question, the bottom of this pyramid, is what is the origin of life? Where does life come from? It's the first question. The second question, what is the origin of human life? Because maybe human life doesn't come from where the other life comes from. That's an interesting question. We're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. The third question, what is our relationship to our bodies? Are we separate from our bodies? Are we powerless when it comes to influencing the well-being and the healing of our bodies, or is there something else that's happening? The next question, what is our relationship to the world beyond our bodies? It's very similar to the previous question, but it's about us and our relationship to the world out there. Are we somehow connected to that world, or are we separate and powerless to influence the circumstances of our lives? Do things just happen for no reason? The next question, what is our relationship to the past? Do we have a linear relationship to civilization? In other words, has it happened only one time? Did civilization begin 5,000 years ago, as we've been taught in the schools for the last 150 years? And there has been a linear progression to the pinnacle of sophistication that we find in our world today. Is that really what civilization is all about? Is there something more? The next question, the last question, is what is our relationship to nature? What is the fundamental rule of the natural world? Well, these are the questions that science uses to answer, who am I? If you were educated in the West, as I was, and I think most of us probably were, in the last 150 years, we have been steeped in the scientific story. It is a story of separation, competition, and conflict. That story says, as we begin at the bottom of the pyramid, that the origin of life, it's completely random. Now we know the physical evidence no longer supports that. The origin of human life. What is the origin of human life? We've been told that is completely random, and the theory of evolution has been used to justify that. What I'm going to share with you today is why that theory no longer supports the ideas when it comes to humans. So I want to be really clear about this. Evolution is a fact for some forms of life. As a geologist, I can see that. But when it comes to humans, the evidence breaks down. And we're going to dive a little deeper into that in just a few moments. The next question, what is our relationship to our bodies? We've been taught that we are separate from our bodies, that we are essentially powerless when it comes to the healing and the ability to influence what happens in our bodies. The next question, what is our relationship to the world around us? We have been taught that we are separate from our world and essentially powerless when it comes to influencing the events of life in the world around us. The next question, what have we been taught for 150 years? Is that civilization is linear. It happened one time. It began about 5,000, maybe 5,500 years ago, during the time of ancient Sumeria, and that there has been this linear progression, this is what we're taught, evolving over time to the sophistication of what we see today. The last question, 1859, Charles Darwin released a book entitled The Origin of Species. And in that book, he defined what we now have believed to be the fundamental rule of nature. And that is the rule of survival of the strongest. And these are Darwin's own words from his text, survival of the strongest, that nature is based upon this model of competition and conflict. So in your mind's eye, if you can see this in the pyramid, on the left-hand side, if you're taking notes at the very top of your pyramid, write false scientific assumptions and then put a big X through every one of those things that I just mentioned. Because it is now peer-reviewed science. It's not my opinion, it's not my theory, it's not my hypothesis, it's not Greg's story. Peer-reviewed science has now overturned every one of those ideas, of those beliefs that you and I have been taught, the story that you and I have been taught. But here's the thing. There is a reluctance, and I think it's fair to say, in many cases, a resistance in mainstream media to share the new discoveries in public classrooms, in public textbooks, in public television documentaries. We are clinging, maybe not you and me, academia is clinging to the old story. New discoveries have now overturned every one of those ideas. I'm going to share these with you right now. In your mind's eye, in that inverted pyramid, if you begin at the bottom, the origin of life, we know it's not random. The origin of human life is definitely not random. DNA is telling us this. Our relationship to our bodies, we know that we are deeply connected to our bodies. Thoughts, feelings, emotions, beliefs trigger the chemistry in our heart and our brain that is released into the body, and those emotions are based upon the way that we feel and our perceptions and our response to what happens in our lives and our world. The next question, our relationship to the world beyond our bodies. We now know that we are deeply connected to the world beyond our bodies, and science is telling us this. I have to tell you, it's no longer a question in the scientific world as to whether or not we are connected to one another in all things. Quantum physics has now told us that the connection exists. Here's the question. The question is, how deep does that connection go? How much influence do we really have when it comes to us and our relationship to the world around us? These are the things that we're going to explore through this series. And the question of civilization, is it linear? No, the new discoveries are telling us now that civilization is cyclic. We are living the most recent 5,000-year cycle of civilization that did begin 5,500 years ago in ancient Sumeria. But the archaeological evidence, peer-reviewed evidence, so it's accepted in the scientific world, is now telling us there was another cycle before that, another 5,000-year cycle, and probably one even before that is pushing the date for technologically advanced civilizations back into the last ice age and before. So we're talking 12, 15,000 years ago is when these advanced technological civilizations existed. The last of our questions, and this is so powerful. What is the fundamental rule of nature? We've been taught that that fundamental rule is competition and conflict. The best science of the 20th and now the 21st century is telling us that while competition happens, and we certainly see that, nature is based on the model of cooperation and what biologists call mutual aid. And to the degree that we see the competition and the conflict, that tells us how far we have strayed from the natural order, from nature's deepest truths. So when we consider all of these things, this pyramid now becomes the lens of perception through which we may answer the question, who am I? And when we begin to see ourselves as connected to one another, connected to our bodies, connected to the world, in a world of cooperation, living in a civilization that is cyclic and has a history that we can learn from, it changes everything. It changes everything. For example, what I'd like to do, let me just zero in on one of these items that I think is so powerful and make such a difference in your life and my life right now. And that is this idea of evolution and where we come from. We have been taught since 1859, since Darwin released his book, The Origin of Species, that we are the product of a long evolutionary journey that happened through these mutations, random mutations. When the mutations serve us, we keep them, and when we don't, we discard them. But the evidence no longer supports this. The DNA no longer supports this. I'm just going to cut to the chase right here. Humans, modern humans, us, we showed up on this earth 200,000 years ago. We do not know how or where or why we showed up. There appears to be no evolutionary path leading to our appearance. We showed up intact with everything that we have today. We showed up all of a sudden with a 50% larger brain size than the nearest primate, an advanced nervous system, an advanced ability for language, advanced ability for digital access to our world, opposing thumbs and forefingers. And here's the key. We showed up with access, the ability to intentionally access an extended neural network in a way that no other form of life has. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean to you and me? That's where we're going here. Extended neural network. In 1991, scientists discovered in the human heart 40,000 specialized cells. They're called sensory neurites. They are specialized cells that are essentially brain-like cells, but they're not in the brain in our head. They're in our heart. And there's such a concentration of them that they're actually called the little brain in the heart. Here's why this is important. These sensory neurites, only discovered in 91, published in 94. I mean, this is how recent this information is. These specialized cells, they think independently of the neurons in our brain. These specialized cells in our heart, they remember independently of the brain in our head. They learn independently of the brain in our head. Okay, so we've all learned to think and feel and remember through our cranial brain. What about our heart? Do you know how to access the language of your heart so that you can tap your heart's wisdom, your heart's intuition? Do you know what that language is? This is where the beauty of these discoveries come together. Because when I was in school, I was taught that the brain is the master organ of the body, and I think probably you were taught the same thing. And the brain certainly is important. But what we now know is that the brain receives many of the instructions that tell it what to do from the heart. So the heart is sending signals to the brain, and the brain then is responding to these signals. This is where it gets really, really interesting, because what we now know is that we can function with the brain. We can think and learn and remember from our brain only. There are some cultures and some traditions that have learned to do just the opposite. From the time they're born, they think, learn, and remember. They interpret the outside world through their hearts as children. Then they begin to learn to interpret the world through their brain. Here's where we benefit from both of these. We can harmonize our heart and our brain together. We can tune the nervous system in our heart and our brain, between our heart and our brain. We can tune the sensory neurites in our heart to the neurons in our brain. So we're talking about two organs. I'll be very clear. Two organs, one powerful, potent neural network. And when we do this, when we tune our heart and our brain together, two organs, a single potent neural network, we open the door to the extraordinary experiences that we've read about from the monks and the nuns and the abbots and the shamans and the ancient and the indigenous traditions. The experiences that often were considered mystical, only experienced by special people with special abilities. Now we know that's not true. 200,000 years ago, we showed up on this earth. We showed up with the wiring for these abilities intact. It did not develop slowly over a long period of time as an evolutionary process. That means that we are wired, we are designed to have these experiences and to be able to use them in our everyday lives. And what I'd like to do in the time that we have remaining here, what I'd like to do is let's just have an experience, one experience of how to access the beginning, this doorway to all of these other experiences, deep intuition, access to the subconscious, precognition, All of these experiences, they all result from our ability to move into our hearts. And that should come as no surprise because that's where those sensory neurites are located. So if I invite you to move into your heart, do you know what to do? Do you know how to do that? Now, I've had people look at me and they say, well, Greg, that's silly. Of course I know how to move into my heart. And then when they're tested in the laboratory, what we discover is this, that we in the West are so conditioned as a general population. We're so conditioned to living in our brain that when we're asked, when we're invited to move into our hearts, we stay in our brain and think about what it would be like if we were in our hearts, but we're still in our brains doing it. To me, this is the advantage. This is the power of spending time with our indigenous family, with our brothers and sisters in those monasteries and those nunneries and in the jungles of the Yucatan and the Andes Mountains, because they have the same questions and they go through the same process as we do when we try to access our hearts, and they've had to learn. And while we can glean from texts and books, there's nothing like sitting with a shaman or a monk or a nun in their monastery, in their land, in their place, their sacred place, and looking them right in the eye and asking them, how do you do this? How do you move into your heart? So let's do this. Let's take this opportunity together in this intimate moment and begin the first step of the process that opens the door to these amazing, empowering, extraordinary mystical experiences. Let's move into our hearts. So I'm going to invite you first to simply close your eyes so that you're shifting your awareness from the outer world into your inner world. And this sends a very powerful signal to your body. This is the first step. A very powerful signal that you are now turning your awareness, focusing inward. And I'm going to invite you to shift that focus from your mind into your heart. Now, this is where the indigenous perspective is so powerful, because what our indigenous family says is that if we can touch our heart center gently in a way that's comfortable for us, it can be an open palm, like we see in the Middle East, like we see in the jungles in the Yucatan, the people greet themselves and one another in the morning this way. What we see the Buddhists doing is creating a mudra with their hands together. It's called the prayer mudra, and they actually touch their heart center in this way. Or many people will simply take an index finger or middle finger and just touch their heart center. Here's the key. Here's why we do this. Wherever your body feels the sensation, your awareness will automatically shift to that place. Your awareness will shift to the place of that sensation. So when you touch your heart center, your sternum, right here, your awareness is going right there to your heart. And this is one of the keys that we find in the indigenous communities to beginning this process, to moving into our hearts. All right, once we are in our hearts, right here, begin to breathe a little slower than usual. Whatever's comfortable for you, maybe 5 seconds inhale, 5 seconds exhale. This simple act sends a very powerful second signal to your body, because the only time you would slow your breathing to 5 seconds in or 5 seconds out is when you are safe, or when you feel that you are in a place that's safe. This safe signal, now that you are creating in your heart, permeates your body. It changes your body chemistry. And we're going to talk more about that in this series. For right now, here's what we've done. We have moved our awareness from our mind into our heart, and we are breathing a little slower, as if the breath is coming from our heart. And I'm going to give you a moment just to do that. I'm going to do the same. Okay, now that you are in this space, this is the beginning. There are more steps. I'm going to share them with you in subsequent videos. But this is the beginning, because if we can't get into our hearts, the other steps aren't going to have the same impact. Once we're in our hearts, you remember those sensory neurites that I just mentioned that think, feel, and remember on their own? I'm going to invite you to ask your heart a question, any question. something that you've always wanted to know, and every time you ask another person, they give you a different answer. So you don't know which is right and which is wrong, and you feel like you're pulled in a million different directions, like I did when I was getting ready to leave the corporations, and I didn't know what was right for me. When I was in my heart on Mount Sinai, as described in the first video, this is what was happening for me. So you have this opportunity now. Your heart knows. So here you are, in your heart right now, accessing 40,000 sensory neurites that think, feel, and remember independently of those in the brain. Ask your heart a question. And it doesn't take long to answer, because your heart doesn't tell you a story. The heart answers in brief, concise statements that have no judgment and no fear and are meaningful to you. I'm going to ask you, how did it feel? How did it feel when you moved your awareness into your heart and you began to breathe differently and you closed your eyes? What did you feel? What was different from your everyday world? This is going to be important to you in future portions of the series, because it opens the door to this gateway to the extraordinary possibilities. I want to thank you for spending the time with me today and allowing me to share this indigenous, ancient, precious wisdom, this deep insight with you. When we go into the deeper aspects, what happens next? How do we go from being in our heart to opening the door to the deep aspects of intuition? And what does it mean in our everyday lives? This is where we're going to go. In the next video, we're going to take these ideas even deeper. We'll take them to the next level. I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks so much.